The Whispering Shadows. The house stood at the edge of the forest, a relic of a forgotten time. Its faded exterior, cracked windows, and slanted roof bore the weight of decades of abandonment. Locals referred to it as the Whispering Shadows House, a name born from the tales of strange occurrences whispered from generation to generation. No one ventured close, not even to steal its aged bricks or shattered glass. The rumors were enough to keep everyone away, except for those foolish or desperate enough to ignore them. Daniel Blake was neither foolish nor desperate, just curious. A freelance photographer with a penchant for the eerie and mysterious, Daniel had made a name for himself by exploring locations deemed too haunted or cursed. His camera captured more than just the decrepit remains of forgotten places. It sometimes caught glimpses of things he couldn't explain. That's what drew him to the house, perched ominously at the edge of Blackwood Forest. As he approached the gate, his breath fogged in the cool evening air. The trees around the property swayed gently in the breeze, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The gate creaked open with an unwelcoming groan as Daniel pushed it, stepping into a yard overrun with weeds and debris. His boots crunched against gravel as he made his way to the front porch, his camera slung around his neck. The front door was ajar, revealing a dark interior that seemed to exhale the scent of damp wood and decay. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but curiosity was a force he couldn't resist. He turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The air was heavier than it should have been, as if the house itself was alive and holding its breath. Dust particles danced in the beam of his flashlight, creating an illusion of movement. The entryway opened into a large living room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, some torn, exposing the decayed fabric underneath. A grand piano sat in one corner, its keys yellowed and cracked. A faint melody seemed to linger in the air, though the piano remained untouched. Daniel set up his tripod and began capturing the eerie beauty of the room. As he adjusted the focus, a sound echoed from upstairs, a slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep. He froze, his heart racing. He turned off his camera and listened intently. Another creak followed, this time closer. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. There was no response, only silence. He swallowed hard and aimed his flashlight at the staircase. The wooden steps loomed before him, their shadows stretching like fingers across the walls. Against his better judgment, he climbed the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The hallway above was narrow, lined with doors on either side. The air was colder here, almost suffocating. He moved cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the faded wallpaper peeling from the walls. The first door he opened revealed a bedroom. The bed was neatly made, but the blanket was oddly smooth, as if no one had touched it in decades. A single porcelain doll sat on the nightstand, its painted eyes staring at him. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hall slammed shut with a deafening bang. Daniel spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam flickered for a moment before stabilizing. He hurried to the door, his instincts telling him to leave, but his curiosity urging him forward. The door was locked. He tried turning the knob again, but it wouldn't budge. As he stepped back, the sound of faint whispers filled the air. It wasn't a single voice, but a chorus of murmurs, indistinct yet undeniably present. The whispers grew louder, circling him like an invisible storm. Panic surged through him, and he banged on the door, shouting, "Who's there?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, without warning, the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in shadows. Daniel hesitated before stepping inside, his flashlight scanning the empty space. It was another bedroom, smaller than the first. The only piece of furniture was a rocking chair in the corner, swaying gently as if someone had just risen from it. The temperature plummeted, and Daniel could see his breath again. He raised his camera, snapping photos in quick succession. Through the lens, the room appeared normal, but when he reviewed the images on the screen, He froze. In one of the photos, the rocking chair was occupied, a faint silhouette of a woman, her head tilted as if watching him. His pulse raced as he lowered the camera. The chair was empty now, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. He backed out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he reached the hallway, he felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. The whispers returned, louder this time, and seemed to come from every direction. He bolted down the stairs, his flashlight flickering wildly. He didn't stop until he was outside, gasping for air. The house loomed behind him, its windows dark and unyielding. As Daniel caught his breath, he noticed something on his camera. The screen displayed a series of photos he didn't remember taking, images of himself, standing in the very room he had just fled, his expression blank and eyes wide with terror. His hands trembled as he deleted the photos, but one refused to be erased. The silhouette of the woman in the rocking chair remained, her gaze now fixed directly at the camera, as if she knew he was watching. The night was eerily quiet as Daniel hurried back to his car. As he drove away, the road stretched endlessly before him, and every shadow seemed to move in the corner of his eye. The house was behind him, but something told him he hadn't left it entirely. The tires of Daniel's car hummed against the asphalt, a sound that should have been soothing, but tonight it was anything but. His heart was still racing, his grip on the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white. The events in the house played on a loop in his mind. The whispers, the shadowy figure in the rocking chair, and the inexplicable photos on his camera. The headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the winding road ahead. Blackwood Forest flanked either side of the road, its dense trees forming an almost impenetrable wall. The occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze felt like whispers, distant but persistent. He tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it clung to him like a second skin. Glancing at his rearview mirror, he saw nothing but the empty road behind him. Yet he couldn't shake the sensation that something was following him. He turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but all he got was static. Frustrated, he turned it off, the silence now deafening in its intensity. The road stretched on, seemingly endless. He checked his GPS, but the screen froze, displaying an error message he'd never seen before. Signal lost. Unable to recalculate route. Great, Daniel muttered under his breath, glancing at the dashboard. The clock had stopped at 11:13 p.m. That didn't make sense. It had been closer to midnight when he left the house. He glanced out the window, trying to find a landmark or a sign to indicate he was headed in the right direction, but the forest was unyielding, and the road looked the same no matter how far he drove. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. He had been on this road before, or so it seemed. Daniel slowed the car to a crawl, the unease gnawing at him. He reached for his phone, hoping to get some navigation help, but the screen was blank. No power, even though it had been fully charged when he left. "Come on," he muttered, slamming the phone against his palm. It flickered to life for a split second, just long enough for him to see a message that made his blood run cold. "You can't leave." The phone went dark again, and he nearly dropped it. His foot pressed harder on the gas, the car lurching forward. The forest blurred past him, and he kept his eyes fixed on the road. But no matter how far he drove, the scenery refused to change. A familiar shape loomed ahead, a weathered road sign with peeling paint. As his headlights illuminated it, his stomach dropped. It read, "Blackwood Forest, 2 miles." "That's impossible," Daniel whispered. He had already driven miles away from the forest. He glanced at the rear-view mirror, expecting to see the house in the distance, but there was nothing, only darkness. A loud thud jolted him from his thoughts, and the car swerved violently. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. Something had hit the side of the car, hard enough to leave a dent. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, his breath visible in the frigid air. The night was unnaturally still, as if the world had paused just for him. He circled the car, his flashlight beam scanning for any signs of what had hit him. The driver's side door had a deep dent, as though something or someone had struck it. But there were no tracks, no fallen branches, nothing to explain the impact. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees. He turned toward the forest, the beam of his flashlight piercing the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. The rustling stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. He took a step back toward the car, every nerve in his body screaming at him to leave. But as he turned, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. "Damn it!" Daniel fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it against his palm. It sputtered back to life just as he caught movement in the corner of his eye. He spun around, aiming the beam at the forest's edge. A figure stood there, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its silhouette almost skeletal. The figure didn't move, but Daniel felt its gaze bore into him. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice shaking. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a marionette being manipulated by unseen strings. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Stay back," he yelled, though his voice lacked conviction. The figure stopped at the edge of the forest, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. The silence was broken by a sound that made Daniel's blood turn to ice, a low, guttural whisper. It wasn't coming from the figure, but from all around him, as if the forest itself was speaking. "You shouldn't have come." The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. Daniel bolted for the car, fumbling with the door handle. He threw himself inside and locked the doors, his hands shaking as he started the engine. As he drove away, he glanced in the rear-view mirror. The figure was still there, standing motionless at the edge of the road. But now, there were others. Dozens of shadowy figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Daniel floored the accelerator, the car racing down the road. The whispers followed him, growing louder despite the distance he was putting between himself and the forest. When he finally looked forward again, his heart sank. The same peeling road sign loomed ahead, and the words on it twisted into something new: "You can't escape." The car screeched to a halt, and Daniel sat frozen, his hands gripping the wheel. The shadows began to creep closer, their forms growing more distinct. A wave of cold washed over him as he realized he wasn't just being followed. He was being hunted. Daniel's foot remained pressed on the accelerator, his car tearing down the endless road. He had stopped trying to make sense of what was happening. His focus was singular: escape. The forest blurred past him, the shadows growing darker and denser with every passing second. But the road was unrelenting. It looped back upon itself in impossible ways, forcing him past the same haunting landmarks. The peeling road sign loomed again, taunting him with its silent message: "You can't escape." "This isn't real," Daniel muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "It's not real." The whispers that had followed him earlier had gone silent, but the oppressive weight in the air remained. He turned the radio knob, hoping for something, anything to distract him from the suffocating quiet. Static crackled, then a voice emerged, faint but unmistakable. "Daniel." He froze, his hands gripping the wheel. The voice was a low, raspy whisper, distorted yet eerily familiar. "Why did you come here?" He slammed the radio off, but the voice didn't stop. It filled the car as though it was coming from the very air around him. "You've seen too much. You can't leave." "Shut up," Daniel shouted, his voice echoing in the small space. The car shuddered suddenly, as if something had collided with it. He swerved, the tires screeching against the road. Fighting to regain control, he felt a chill spread through the car's interior. His breath fogged the windshield, obscuring his view. And then he saw it. In the rearview mirror, a figure sat in the back seat. Its face was shrouded in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. Daniel's blood ran cold as he caught the faint glint of two glowing eyes staring at him. He didn't dare turn around. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond, but the temperature in the car continued to drop. The windshield fogged completely, forcing Daniel to slow down. He reached out with a trembling hand, wiping the glass in frantic strokes. The fog cleared just enough for him to see the road again, but the figure was now in the passenger seat. It moved impossibly fast, its head tilting toward him with an audible crack. The glowing eyes burned brighter, and Daniel could feel its gaze piercing into his soul. "Get out!" he screamed, swiping at the figure with one hand while trying to steer with the other. His hand passed through nothing but icy air. The figure's mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should, revealing an abyss of darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, filling the car with their unbearable noise. In a blind panic, Daniel slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, throwing him forward against the seatbelt. When he looked up, the figure was gone. He sat there, panting, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of his ragged breaths. Daniel leaned back, trying to steady his nerves. His heart pounded in his chest as he replayed the events in his mind. Was he losing his grip on reality? The sound of fingernails scraping against glass pulled him from his thoughts. It was coming from the driver's side window. Slowly, he turned his head. A pale hand, skeletal and claw-like, pressed against the glass. Behind it was a face, gaunt and hollow, its flesh stretched tightly over jagged bones. Its eyes were empty sockets, yet Daniel could feel them watching him. The thing grinned, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. Without thinking, Daniel floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward and throwing the creature out of sight. His heart raced as he sped down the road, his eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. But the whispers were inside the car now, growing louder with every mile. "You can't leave." They repeated the phrase over and over, a sinister chant that filled his head until it was unbearable. He screamed, pounding the steering wheel. "Why? What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, chilling response. "Your soul." The car's tires screeched as Daniel slammed on the brakes, his mind racing. He could no longer tell if he was running toward safety or deeper into a trap. His surroundings had become a blur of darkness and twisted trees, but something new appeared ahead. A faint glow on the horizon. Hope flared within him. Maybe it was a gas station or a house, anywhere but here. He pushed the car forward, gripping the wheel like a lifeline. As he drew closer, the glow sharpened into familiar outlines, and his stomach sank. It wasn't a gas station. It wasn't help. It was the house. The same dilapidated structure loomed before him, its windows dark and lifeless. But there was something different now. The front door, once ajar, stood wide open, as if waiting for him. Daniel's breath quickened. No, this isn't possible." He threw the car into reverse, slamming the accelerator, but the vehicle refused to move. It sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in the suffocating silence. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They came from the house, beckoning him, pulling him toward it. "You must come back." "No!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. He grabbed his flashlight, abandoning the car, and stumbled onto the gravel driveway. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet moved as if under someone else's control, dragging him closer to the house. The wind picked up, carrying with it the stench of rot and decay. The ground beneath him felt soft, almost as if it were alive, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. He glanced down and recoiled in horror. The earth was moving. Tiny black tendrils snaked out of the ground, writhing like worms. They reached for him, brushing against his boots, trying to pull him under. Panicking, Daniel sprinted toward the house. It wasn't safety. It was an escape from the living ground that sought to consume him. The whispers grew louder as he crossed the threshold, stepping into the house's oppressive darkness once more. The air inside was heavier than before, thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic, like blood. The door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into an unnatural silence. His flashlight flickered, its beam casting erratic shadows on the walls. "Why me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The house didn't answer, but the atmosphere grew colder, sharper, as if the walls themselves were listening. He moved cautiously, his flashlight scanning the room. The furniture was as he had left it, draped in tattered sheets. But something was different. On the grand piano in the corner, a single key pressed itself down, releasing a mournful note that lingered in the air. Daniel froze, his flashlight fixed on the piano. The key moved again, followed by another, then another. A haunting melody filled the room, played by invisible hands. The whispers returned, weaving themselves into the music. "Welcome back, Daniel." He turned toward the voice, and his flashlight illuminated the silhouette of a figure standing at the base of the stairs. It was the same woman from the photograph, her head tilted unnaturally, her eyes hollow and void of emotion. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. The woman didn't move. She simply stared at him, her presence suffocating. Then, without warning, she lifted her arm and pointed to the stairs. Daniel shook his head, taking a step back. "I'm not going up there." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The piano's melody became discordant, each note stabbing into his ears like knives. The woman's expression remained unchanged, but her presence grew heavier, pressing him toward the staircase. Reluctantly, he moved forward, ascending the creaking steps one at a time. The air grew colder with each step, until his breath was visible again. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before him, identical to how he had left it. The doors on either side were closed, except for the one at the end. It stood wide open, revealing the same room with the rocking chair. The chair was moving again, its creaks echoing down the hall. Daniel hesitated, but the force pulling him forward was relentless. He stepped into the room, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the chair. It was empty. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. The rocking chair tipped forward and crashed to the floor, splintering into pieces. Daniel spun around, but the doorway was gone. In its place was a solid wall. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the wall, shouting for help. "Let me out!" The growl deepened, and the temperature plummeted. He turned back to the room, and his flashlight revealed the woman standing inches from him. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile, her hollow eyes staring directly into his. She opened her mouth, and the whispers poured out, louder and more deafening than ever. They weren't coming from her alone. They came from the walls, the floor, the very air around him. Daniel dropped the flashlight, its beam flickering wildly as it rolled across the floor. The woman stepped closer, her skeletal hand reaching for him. "No!" he screamed, backing into the wall. The whispers formed a single chilling sentence that echoed through his mind. "You belong to us now." The world tilted, and Daniel felt himself falling. Darkness enveloped him, and the whispers followed him into the void. Daniel's scream echoed into nothingness as he plummeted through an endless abyss. The air was thick, heavy, and seemed to press against his skin like a living entity. There was no light, no sound, just the whispers that accompanied his descent. They ebbed and flowed like waves, surrounding him in an oppressive symphony of voices. He landed abruptly, the impact jarring but not painful. The ground beneath him felt damp and uneven, like wet stone. A faint, dim glow emanated from an unseen source, casting eerie shadows on the jagged walls of what appeared to be a cavern. Daniel pushed himself up, his breath visible in the cold air. The whispers had faded, replaced by a deep rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It came from all around him, vibrating through the walls and the floor. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. He fumbled for his flashlight, finding it miraculously intact on the ground beside him. The beam was weak, flickering as though it was struggling against the oppressive darkness. He shone it around, the light revealing twisted organic patterns on the walls, as if the cavern itself were alive. Then he saw them, handprints, hundreds of them, etched into the stone, their shapes distorted and elongated. They overlapped, some smeared as if clawing at the walls in desperation. Daniel's pulse quickened as he stepped forward, his shoes squelching against the wet ground. The faint glow grew stronger the deeper he went, illuminating a narrow pathway that seemed to wind endlessly into the distance. The heartbeat grew louder. He moved cautiously, his flashlight scanning the walls and floor. The path was littered with fragments of broken objects, pieces of furniture, shattered picture frames, and old, rusted tools. Among them he spotted a stuffed toy, its fur matted and decayed. Picking it up, he turned it over in his hands. It was a rabbit, its button eyes missing and its stuffing spilling out through a tear in its side. A memory flashed through his mind of a child clutching the same toy, crying softly in the corner of a dimly lit room. The image disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving Daniel disoriented. He dropped the toy and pressed on, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The pathway opened up into a vast chamber, the source of the faint glow. At the center of the room stood a grotesque altar, formed from twisted roots and jagged stone. It pulsed faintly, the light emanating from within its cracks. Daniel's flashlight dimmed further, the beam sputtering as if repelled by the altar's presence. He approached it cautiously, drawn by an invisible force. The altar was covered in symbols, intricate, looping patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked directly at them. At its base lay a collection of objects, a rusted pocket watch, a cracked mirror, and a journal with its pages torn and charred. His eyes were drawn to the mirror. Its surface was clouded, but as he reached out, the fog cleared, revealing his reflection, or what should have been his reflection. The face staring back at him was not his own. It was gaunt and hollow, its eyes sunken and glowing faintly. The mouth twisted into a malevolent grin, sharp teeth glinting in the faint light. Daniel stumbled back, his heart racing. The reflection moved on its own, stepping closer to the glass until it pressed its face against it. The surface rippled like water, and the figure began to push through. "No," Daniel whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." The figure stepped out of the mirror, its form shifting and flickering like a distorted shadow. It towered over him, its glowing eyes fixed on his. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied. They came from the figure, from the walls, from the altar itself. "You cannot escape," the figure said, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones. "You are part of this now." Daniel turned and ran, his flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The chamber seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around him. He could hear the figure's footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, yet impossibly close. As he ran, the whispers grew louder, forming words that echoed in his mind. "You belong to us." He stumbled, falling to his knees. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, its beam flickering before going dark. He was plunged into complete darkness, the whispers now deafening. Desperate, he scrambled to his feet, but the ground beneath him gave way. He fell again, this time landing in a pool of icy water. The liquid seeped into his clothes, chilling him to the bone. He tried to stand, but the water was shallow, only a few inches deep. He shone the flashlight around, but its light couldn't pierce the oppressive darkness. Then he saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, floating just beneath the surface of the water. Their eyes were open, unblinking, and their mouths moved in silent screams. Daniel recoiled, splashing water as he scrambled away. The faces began to rise, their forms taking shape. They were human, or at least they had been. Their bodies were bloated and twisted, their skin pale and translucent. One of them reached for him, its hand brushing against his leg. He cried out, kicking wildly. The figures didn't stop. They rose higher, their empty eyes fixed on him. The whispers became a single unified voice, filling the cavern with its sinister presence. "Accept your fate." Daniel's scream was swallowed by the darkness as the figures closed in, their cold hands pulling him beneath the surface. The icy water enveloped Daniel, dragging him downward into an abyss that seemed bottomless. He thrashed and kicked, but the hands pulling him were relentless, their grip cold and unyielding. His lungs burned as he fought to hold his breath, the pressure around him growing unbearable. Then, just as he thought his chest would burst, he broke through the surface, not into water, but into air. Gasping, he collapsed onto solid ground, his body trembling. He opened his eyes and found himself back in the house. The room was the same as before, with its rotting furniture and oppressive atmosphere. But something had changed. The walls pulsated faintly, as though the house itself were alive, breathing in tandem with the whispers that now filled the air. "Why?" Daniel croaked, his voice barely audible. The whispers answered, their tone a mixture of mockery and malice. "You were chosen." Daniel pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking. The room seemed to warp and shift around him, the furniture melting into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with the stench of decay, making it hard to breathe. "Chosen for what?" he demanded, his voice rising with desperation. The floor beneath him began to crack, glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. From the cracks emerged black tendrils, writhing and twisting as they reached for him. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room for an escape. The doorway was back, but it was no longer empty. The woman stood there, her hollow eyes fixed on him. Behind her loomed the figure from the mirror, its shadowy form shifting unnaturally. "Your soul will sustain us," the woman said, her voice a chilling echo. Daniel shook his head, backing into a corner. "No, this isn't real." The tendrils snaked closer, their movements deliberate and predatory. The figure stepped into the room, its presence overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, drilling into Daniel's mind. Desperate, he grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor and swung it at the nearest tendril. The wood passed through it harmlessly, as though it were made of smoke. "You cannot fight," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the room. "You are ours." Daniel screamed in defiance, throwing the chair leg at the figure. It didn't flinch. The tendrils wrapped around his legs, pulling him toward the glowing cracks in the floor. He clawed at the ground, his fingers scraping against the rotting wood. "Let me go." The woman knelt beside him, her face inches from his. Her smile was a grotesque mockery of humanity, her teeth sharp and blackened. "Your struggle only feeds us," she whispered, her breath icy against his skin. The tendrils wrapped around his torso now, dragging him closer to the light. He could feel its heat, unnatural and suffocating. Images flashed through his mind, visions of others who had been pulled into this nightmare before him. He saw their faces twisted in agony, their souls consumed by the house. "No," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I won't let you take me." The whispers paused, replaced by a low, rumbling laughter. The figure loomed over him, its glowing eyes boring into his. "You already belong to us," it said. With a final surge of strength, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his lighter. He flicked it open, the small flame dancing in the darkness. "If I'm going, I'm taking you with me," he growled. The laughter stopped. The tendrils recoiled slightly, as if in hesitation. The woman's smile faltered, and for the first time a flicker of fear crossed her hollow eyes. Daniel thrust the lighter toward the floor, igniting the rotting wood. The fire spread rapidly, consuming the tendrils and filling the room with thick, acrid smoke. The figure let out a guttural roar, its form flickering like a dying flame. The woman screamed, her voice blending with the whispers into a deafening cacophony. The house began to shake, the walls cracking and splintering as the fire consumed it. Daniel clawed his way toward the doorway, the flames licking at his heels. The figure reached for him, its shadowy hand stretching impossibly long. But the fire was faster. It engulfed the room, consuming the figure and the woman in a blinding inferno. Daniel stumbled out of the house, collapsing onto the gravel driveway. He looked back to see the entire structure ablaze, the flames reaching high into the night sky. The whispers faded, replaced by the crackling of the fire. For the first time, the oppressive weight in the air lifted. He lay there, gasping for breath, as the house collapsed into itself, leaving nothing but ash and embers. The road stretched out before him, empty and silent. The forest was still, the oppressive presence gone. Daniel didn't know how long he lay there, staring at the sky. Eventually he forced himself to his feet, his body aching but alive. He walked down the road, the house now a distant memory. But as he glanced over his shoulder, he saw a single light flicker in the distance, where the house had stood. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "You can never leave." The end.